Ladies and gentlemen, we live in an age where words like justice, equality, and anti-racism echo through every corner of our cultural landscape. At face value, these ideas represent some of the noblest aspirations humanity has ever pursued. Who among us doesn't want a world free from the scourge of racism? A world where every individual is judged, not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. But as history teaches us, even the most virtuous ideals can be twisted into something dangerous when wielded without caution, reflection, or humility. And so we must ask ourselves, when does anti-racism stop fighting racism and start embodying it? The first step in addressing this question is to confront a hard truth. Sometimes, in our pursuit of justice, we oversimplify the world into good versus evil, victim versus oppressor. But this binary thinking is not only intellectually lazy, it is morally treacherous. When anti-racism becomes a crusade that assigns guilt and virtue solely based on race, we begin to mirror the very injustices we claim to oppose. There is a peril in reducing people to their group identity. Racism itself thrives on that premise that a person is defined, limited, or burdened by their skin color. Yet, ironically, many anti-racist ideologies today perpetuate this same reductionist thinking. Instead of liberating individuals, they imprison them in categories of privilege or oppression. And what happens when anti-racism stops seeking justice and starts seeking revenge? Justice is impartial. It seeks balance, fairness, and healing. Revenge, however, thrives on resentment. It punishes individuals for the sins of their ancestors or the perceived advantages of their birth. It assumes guilt before innocence, punishes before understanding, and enforces conformity instead of dialogue. Consider this: if you tell people that their achievements are invalid because of their skin color or that their failures are someone else's fault, you strip them of the dignity of personal agency. You rob them of the ability to rise above their circumstances or to take pride in their hard-won victories. And in doing so, you create resentment, division, and bitterness. The policies that emerge from this misguided approach are often equally destructive. Quotas that enforce diversity at the expense of merit not only undermine confidence in institutions, but also perpetuate the stereotype that individuals succeed because of their race rather than their talent. And when we silence dissent in the name of anti-racism, when we brand all disagreement as racism, we trade the virtues of open dialogue and free thought for the suffocating dogma of ideological conformity. Censorship is never the path to progress. It's a tool of tyranny. Perhaps the most insidious consequence of this ideology is the erosion of universal humanism, the idea that we are all fundamentally more alike than we are different. When anti-racism becomes obsessed with categorizing humanity into factions of oppressors and oppressed, it abandons the possibility of unity. It forecloses on the dream of shared humanity. So, where does this leave us? Should we abandon the fight against racism? Absolutely not. But we must fight it wisely. True anti-racism does not seek to replace one hierarchy of oppression with another. It does not demand penance from some and pity for others. It strives to elevate everyone to the shared dignity of equality, opportunity, and mutual respect. In our pursuit of a better world, we must remain vigilant. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, as the saying goes. And when anti-racism becomes racism, it does more than fail in its mission. It becomes the very thing it once opposed. Let us not allow that to happen. Let us instead recommit to the ideals of justice, fairness, and unity, the principles that elevate us all. Anti-racism is a concept rooted in the noble intention of eradicating discrimination and prejudice. At its heart, it seeks to build a world where people are judged on their character and actions rather than the color of their skin. It aspires to correct historical wrongs and dismantle systemic injustices that have perpetuated inequality. However, the path to achieving these goals is fraught with complexity, and when anti-racism is executed without careful thought, it can unintentionally replicate the very evils it seeks to eliminate. History teaches us that even the most virtuous ideals can become dangerous when they are pursued with blind fervor, devoid of self-criticism or humility. Anti-racism, when taken to an extreme, risks becoming a vehicle for a new form of discrimination, a form that, in its zeal to rectify the past, begins to enforce the same divisive principles that racism relies upon. The problem arises when anti-racism shifts from addressing individuals' actions and attitudes to assigning collective guilt or virtue based solely on racial identity. This approach assumes that an entire group of people can be held responsible for societal problems, not because of their individual choices, but because of their skin color or perceived privilege. This is where the moral foundation of anti-racism begins to crumble. By treating people as representatives of a racial group rather than as unique individuals, this ideology reduces them to caricatures. In this process, the complexity and humanity of individuals are lost, replaced by simplistic labels like oppressor or oppressed. Ironically, this mirrors the core logic of racism itself, which has always dehumanized people by viewing them primarily through the lens of race. This shift from individual accountability to collective blame introduces a dangerous moral framework. It suggests that guilt can be inherited or imposed based on historical injustices. While it is undeniable that history has left profound scars on certain communities, the notion that individuals today should bear responsibility for the sins of their ancestors is profoundly unjust. It assumes a form of moral debt that cannot be repaid, creating a cycle of resentment and division. Those targeted as oppressors feel alienated and demonized, while those cast as victims may be encouraged to see themselves as powerless. This dynamic does not promote healing or understanding. Instead, it entrenches hostility and mistrust between groups. Furthermore, the moral danger of this framework is magnified when anti-racism shifts from persuasion to enforcement. In its most extreme forms, anti-racism can adopt a punitive stance, demanding strict adherence to its ideology and punishing dissent. Those who question or critique its methods are often labeled as bigots or racists, effectively silencing meaningful dialogue. This environment stifles intellectual freedom and critical thinking, replacing genuine understanding with fear and compliance. When anti-racism becomes a dogma that cannot be challenged, it risks becoming authoritarian, enforcing its principles through social and cultural pressure rather than genuine conviction. At its worst, this approach to anti-racism fosters an unhealthy obsession with racial identity. It promotes a worldview where race becomes the defining characteristic of a person's experience, overshadowing all other aspects of their humanity. This focus on race, while ostensibly aimed at addressing inequality, inadvertently perpetuates the divisions it claims to oppose. By framing every social interaction and institutional outcome through the lens of race, it reinforces the idea that racial differences are insurmountable barriers to unity. This fixation can prevent society from moving toward a shared sense of human dignity and common purpose. Anti-racism, when practiced with humility and care, has the power to unite people and create a fairer society. However, when it devolves into a rigid ideology that prioritizes group identity over individual merit and justice, it risks becoming indistinguishable from the prejudice it seeks to combat. The challenge lies in striking a balance between addressing systemic issues and maintaining the core principles of fairness, equality, and individual dignity. Only by remaining vigilant against the potential excesses of anti-racism can we ensure that it fulfills its promise of building a better world. One of the central dangers of anti-racism arises when it overemphasizes group identity at the expense of individual identity. Racism itself is built on the flawed premise that people can be judged, categorized, or understood solely based on the color of their skin. This ideology, which treats individuals as nothing more than representatives of a racial group, has led to some of the most catastrophic injustices in human history. Ironically, many modern anti-racist approaches have embraced the same logic, albeit from a different angle, perpetuating a cycle of division that undermines their noble goals. While the intention may be to rectify past injustices, the focus on group identity often leads to a dangerous form of collectivism, where people are defined by their race rather than their character, choices, or unique experiences. The idea of group identity as a primary lens for understanding social dynamics can be seductive. After all, race undeniably plays a role in shaping an individual's opportunities and experiences in society. Acknowledging this reality is important. However, when anti-racism frames individuals entirely through their group identity, it fails to recognize the richness and complexity of human life. A person's actions, dreams, and contributions are reduced to a single attribute, their race. This simplification is not only dehumanizing but also corrosive to the foundational principles of fairness and equality. People become abstractions rather than individuals, and any hope of meaningful connection or understanding is lost. This approach often fosters a kind of collective guilt, particularly among those deemed to belong to historically privileged groups. It assigns blame not for one's actions, but for one's association with a particular racial identity. The assumption is that those born into certain racial groups are inherently complicit in systems of oppression, regardless of their personal beliefs, choices, or efforts to combat injustice. Such a worldview is deeply unjust because it disregards the fundamental principle that morality is rooted in individual responsibility. It suggests that a person's worth or culpability is determined not by their character but by circumstances entirely outside their control, such as their ancestry or the historical injustices associated with their racial group. For those on the other side of this framework, the groups labeled as historically oppressed, the overemphasis on group identity can also have unintended negative consequences. By framing them primarily as victims, this approach risks stripping individuals of their agency and autonomy. The narrative becomes one of perpetual grievance, where success or failure is viewed entirely through the lens of systemic oppression. While it is crucial to address historical injustices and structural barriers, focusing exclusively on victimhood risks creating a disempowering mindset. It can foster a sense of learned helplessness, where individuals are discouraged from pursuing personal growth and achievement because they believe the system is rigged against them. Moreover, overemphasizing group identity can exacerbate societal divisions. When people are taught to see themselves and others primarily as members of racial categories, it reinforces an us versus them mentality. This binary framework pits groups against each other, turning potential allies into adversaries. Instead of fostering mutual understanding and collaboration, it deepens the divides it aims to bridge. Trust erodes, and the possibility of collective progress fades, replaced by an endless cycle of blame and defensiveness. The very nature of group identity as a concept is exclusionary. By its definition, it creates boundaries between people, emphasizing what separates them rather than what unites them. While anti-racism may claim to challenge these divisions, its over-reliance on racial categorization can inadvertently entrench them. The focus on group identity shifts the conversation away from shared humanity and common values, replacing it with an ever-narrowing emphasis on difference. Instead of transcending the barriers of race, this approach reinforces them, making it harder to achieve the harmony and equality that anti-racism ostensibly seeks. Ultimately, while recognizing and addressing the impact of race on society is important, an overemphasis on group identity undermines the moral and practical foundation of anti-racism itself. It risks perpetuating the same divisive thinking it seeks to eradicate, creating new forms of prejudice and inequality in the process. Justice is a cornerstone of any civilized society, a concept that calls for fairness, balance, and an impartial assessment of actions. It operates on the principle that individuals should be held accountable for their choices and rewarded or penalized based on their behavior. However, when anti-racism morphs into a pursuit of vengeance rather than justice, it abandons these principles and risks creating an environment where resentment flourishes. The distinction between justice and revenge may seem subtle, but it is critical. Justice seeks to restore balance and foster reconciliation, while revenge is driven by anger and a desire to punish, often targeting people who bear no personal responsibility for the injustices being addressed. In the context of anti-racism, this divergence becomes apparent when efforts to right historical wrongs shift from addressing systems and structures to punishing individuals based on their racial identity. This approach often relies on the idea of collective guilt, that the descendants of oppressors or those born into a systemically advantaged position are inherently responsible for the suffering of others. While it is true that systemic racism has left deep scars on society, the notion of inherited guilt undermines the fundamental tenet of justice that responsibility lies with the individual, not with their ancestry or group affiliation. This framework not only misdirects the pursuit of justice, but also perpetuates cycles of animosity. People accused of benefiting from privilege, even if they have never personally engaged in discriminatory behavior, are often forced to shoulder the burden of historical sins. They may be asked to atone for actions they never committed, living under the shadow of collective blame. Such an approach does not encourage genuine understanding or empathy. Instead, it fosters defensiveness, bitterness, and a sense of alienation. It becomes difficult to build bridges between communities when one group feels perpetually accused and the other perpetually aggrieved. The pursuit of revenge under the guise of anti-racism is particularly harmful when it manifests in policies or practices that seek to level the playing field by disadvantaging certain groups. Initiatives like race-based hiring quotas, for example, may aim to address inequities but often result in a backlash. They can create resentment among those who feel unfairly excluded or tokenized, undermining the very goals of equality and inclusion. These measures risk being perceived as punitive rather than corrective, which only deepens societal divides. Furthermore, when anti-racism adopts a punitive stance, it risks alienating those who might otherwise be allies. Genuine justice invites dialogue, understanding, and collaboration. Revenge, on the other hand, silences dissent and enforces conformity through fear. In some cases, individuals who question anti-racist ideologies or propose alternative solutions are labeled as racists or accused of perpetuating oppression. This dynamic stifles meaningful conversations and discourages people from engaging in the difficult but necessary work of addressing racism. Instead of fostering progress, it creates an atmosphere of hostility and division. At its core, the shift from justice to revenge represents a moral failure. True justice requires a careful, principled approach that recognizes the complexity of societal issues and seeks solutions that benefit everyone. Revenge, by contrast, operates on the assumption that harm done to one group can be remedied by inflicting harm on another. This tit-for-tat mentality does not resolve injustices, it compounds them, leaving wounds unhealed and relationships fractured. The pursuit of anti-racism should aim to create a society where all individuals are treated with fairness and dignity. This cannot be achieved by perpetuating cycles of blame and punishment. Instead, it requires a commitment to addressing systemic issues while maintaining a focus on individual accountability and the shared goal of building a more just and equitable society. Censorship in any form is a direct threat to the foundations of a free and open society. The ability to speak freely, to express dissent, and to challenge prevailing norms is not just a luxury, it is essential for progress. Yet, when anti-racism adopts a strategy of silencing opposing voices, it crosses a dangerous line that undermines the very principles it claims to champion. Suppressing open dialogue in the name of combating racism may seem like a well-intentioned effort to prevent harm, but it ultimately does more damage than good. By shutting down conversations and branding dissent as inherently racist, anti-racism can drift into authoritarianism, sacrificing the values of free thought and intellectual honesty on the altar of ideological conformity. The fight against racism is, at its core, a moral and intellectual struggle. It requires the ability to confront uncomfortable truths, to engage with opposing perspectives, and to arrive at solutions that are both just and effective. However, when dissenting opinions are dismissed or silenced outright, the conversation becomes one-sided and superficial. Ideas that challenge the dominant anti-racist narrative are not addressed or debated, but are instead labeled as offensive, harmful, or bigoted. This approach does not eradicate racism, it simply drives opposing views underground, where they often fester and grow stronger. When people are unable to voice their concerns or criticisms openly, resentment builds, and the opportunity for understanding and reconciliation is lost. This dynamic creates an atmosphere of fear and compliance rather than genuine conviction. People may outwardly agree with anti-racist principles not because they truly believe in them, but because they fear the social and professional consequences of disagreement. In this environment, conformity is enforced and authenticity is sacrificed. Rather than fostering a society built on mutual respect and understanding, censorship breeds a culture of performative agreement where people say the right things to avoid being ostracized but harbor unspoken doubts or resentments. This disingenuous dynamic is not progress, it is a facade that collapses under scrutiny. The suppression of dialogue also erodes trust in institutions that enforce these restrictions. When people feel that they cannot speak freely without fear of retribution, they begin to question the legitimacy of the rules and the motivations behind them. This skepticism extends to the broader goals of anti-racism, undermining its credibility and effectiveness. Instead of fostering unity, censorship creates divisions as people retreat into ideological echo chambers where their views are reinforced rather than challenged. This polarization makes it even harder to build the bridges necessary for genuine societal change. At its worst, censorship becomes a tool of power, used to enforce a specific ideology and marginalize dissenting voices. It assumes that one perspective is not only correct but also morally superior and beyond question. This is a dangerous assumption, as it leaves no room for self-reflection or improvement. Every movement, no matter how righteous its cause, must remain open to criticism and willing to adapt. When anti-racism rejects this principle, it risks becoming rigid, dogmatic, and exclusionary qualities that are antithetical to the ideals of equality and inclusion. Censorship in the name of anti-racism does not protect marginalized communities, it weakens the collective ability to address the root causes of racism. By prioritizing control over conversation, it alienates potential allies, deepens societal divides, and stifles the creativity and collaboration necessary for meaningful progress. Open dialogue, however uncomfortable, is the only path forward. Without it, anti-racism risks becoming a force that silences rather than empowers, dividing rather than uniting, and stalling the very progress it seeks to achieve. The problem with any movement or ideology that loses its balance is the risk of fostering unintended consequences, and anti-racism is no exception. While its core mission is to combat racism and promote equality, there are cases where it has unintentionally encouraged racial stereotypes and divisions, ironically reinforcing the very systems of thought it seeks to dismantle. In the rush to address historical injustices and ongoing inequities, some anti-racist initiatives have leaned on broad generalizations about racial groups, perpetuating harmful assumptions under the guise of fighting oppression. This contradiction reveals a critical flaw in the execution of anti-racism, the reliance on racial essentialism. Racial essentialism, the idea that individuals are defined primarily or exclusively by their racial identity, undermines the fundamental principle of seeing people as individuals. It assumes that members of a racial group share a uniform set of experiences, perspectives, and characteristics, reducing them to mere representatives of their race. In an anti-racist framework, this often takes the form of assigning moral or social characteristics to people based on their skin color. For example, white individuals might be labeled as inherently privileged or complicit in systems of oppression, while people of color might be viewed as universally oppressed or disadvantaged. While these generalizations may contain kernels of truth in a broad societal sense, they fail to account for the complexity and diversity of individual experiences. This approach not only distorts reality, but also risks alienating the very people it seeks to engage. When white individuals are told that they are inherently part of the problem, regardless of their personal actions or beliefs, it fosters defensiveness and resentment. Many feel unfairly accused, especially if they have spent their lives treating others with respect or actively working against racism. At the same time, framing people of color as perpetual victims can be disempowering. It reduces them to passive figures in a narrative of oppression, overlooking their agency, resilience, and capacity to shape their own lives. The perpetuation of racial stereotypes through anti-racism is particularly troubling because it mirrors the logic of racism itself. Racism has always relied on the belief that people can be understood and categorized based on their race. When anti-racism employs the same logic, even with the best intentions, it legitimizes a worldview that prioritizes race over individuality. This not only reinforces racial divisions, but also undermines the effort to build a society where people are judged by their character and actions rather than their skin color. Additionally, racial essentialism can lead to policies and practices that treat people unequally based on their race, creating new forms of discrimination. For example, programs designed to address historical inequities may unintentionally exclude or disadvantage individuals who do not fit neatly into the categories of oppressed or oppressor. These policies often operate on the assumption that one group has inherent advantages or disadvantages, which is a reductive and dangerous way to approach societal issues. Instead of fostering fairness, they can deepen feelings of injustice and inequality, perpetuating the very dynamics they aim to resolve. Another unintended consequence of anti-racism's reliance on racial essentialism is the entrenchment of an US versus them mentality. By emphasizing group identity over shared humanity, it creates a binary framework that pits groups against each other. This dynamic makes it difficult to build trust, collaboration, and understanding between communities. People are encouraged to see themselves primarily in terms of their racial identity, which can overshadow other aspects of their lives, such as their values, ambitions, or personal struggles. This focus on difference rather than commonality exacerbates division and makes genuine reconciliation more challenging. While anti-racism seeks to dismantle racism, its reliance on racial essentialism risks perpetuating the very stereotypes and divisions it opposes. By prioritizing race as the defining feature of human experience, it undermines the goal of creating a society where individuals are valued for their unique qualities. Anti-racism must be careful not to replicate the logic of racism under a different banner. Instead, it should aim to address systemic issues without reducing people to racial categories, ensuring that its efforts promote unity, understanding, and equality for all. Anti-racism at its core aims to address and rectify historical and systemic injustices tied to race. However, A concerning trend within some anti-racist efforts is the increasing use of tactics that foster division rather than unity. Instead of building bridges across diverse groups, certain approaches rely on cultivating an us versus them dynamic, often framed as oppressors versus oppressed. While this framework might be intended to expose power imbalances and foster awareness, it often has the unintended consequence of creating antagonism between groups, entrenching racial divisions, and perpetuating cycles of mistrust. The framing of anti-racism as a battle between groups can lead to polarization, where people are categorized as either allies or adversaries based on their racial identity. This binary worldview ignores the complexity of human experience and reduces people to rigid labels, such as privileged, or marginalized in practice. This can create an atmosphere where individuals are judged not by their character, actions, or intentions, but by the group they are perceived to belong to. For instance, white individuals might be automatically viewed as beneficiaries of systemic oppression, while people of color might be seen exclusively as victims. Such categorization is not only reductive but also deeply alienating for those who do not feel these labels accurately represent their experiences. By fostering a divisive narrative, anti-racism risks deepening the divides it seeks to mend. When people are repeatedly told that they belong to inherently opposing groups, it becomes harder to foster empathy, collaboration, or shared purpose. White individuals, for example, may feel attacked or unjustly vilified for systemic issues they did not personally create, leading to defensiveness and withdrawal from conversations about race. On the other hand, people of color may feel pigeonholed into roles of perpetual victimhood, which can be disempowering and dismissive of their individual agency and achievements. Both reactions undermine the broader goals of anti-racism, which should aim to inspire collective responsibility and cooperation. Another troubling aspect of this divisive approach is its reliance on guilt and shame as tools for social change. While acknowledging privilege and confronting uncomfortable truths about history are important, repeatedly invoking guilt as a motivator can backfire. Shame tends to provoke defensiveness, resentment, or even outright rejection of the message being delivered. People who feel unfairly blamed for circumstances beyond their control may distance themselves from anti-racist efforts altogether. Rather than fostering genuine understanding and commitment to change, this tactic often results in resistance and entrenched opposition, making progress more difficult to achieve. The divisive rhetoric can also alienate potential allies who might otherwise support anti-racist goals. Many people, regardless of their racial background, want to live in a society that values fairness and equality. However, when anti-racism frames the conversation in terms of adversarial group dynamics, it creates a sense of exclusivity rather than inclusivity. People who might otherwise be open to learning and participating in anti-racist initiatives may feel unwelcome or attacked, which limits the movement's ability to build broad-based coalitions for change. This is especially counterproductive in addressing systemic issues, which require collective effort and collaboration across all groups to dismantle. Moreover, this divisive approach often oversimplifies the complexities of racism and inequality, reducing nuanced issues to rigid binaries. Racism is not a one-dimensional problem. It is deeply embedded in social, economic, and political systems and affects individuals differently based on a multitude of factors, including class, geography, and personal experiences. By framing the issue as an antagonistic struggle between groups, anti-racism risks ignoring these subtleties and adopting solutions that fail to address the root causes of inequality. Instead, it may lead to surface-level remedies that appease one group while alienating another, perpetuating a cycle of division rather than resolving it. Finally, the divisive nature of this approach undermines the potential for unity and shared purpose. Building a society free of racism requires bringing people together under a common vision of equality and mutual respect. When anti-racism relies on tactics that emphasize division, it moves further away from this vision, making it harder to achieve lasting change. By fostering an us versus them mentality, it sacrifices the opportunity to build a society based on understanding, solidarity, and shared responsibility for creating a fairer world. The misuse of moral superiority within the anti-racism movement represents one of its most significant pitfalls. While anti-racism's goals are grounded in the pursuit of justice, equality, and human dignity, there are instances where proponents adopt an air of self-righteousness that stifles meaningful dialogue and alienates potential allies. This moral posturing often transforms the movement from a space for collaboration and learning into a platform for judgment and condemnation. When anti-racism operates as a vehicle for asserting moral superiority rather than addressing systemic injustices, it risks becoming divisive and counterproductive, undermining its own mission. One of the primary issues with moral superiority is that it creates a hierarchical framework in which individuals are judged based on their perceived alignment with anti-racist ideology. Those who are vocal supporters of the movement are seen as morally virtuous, while those who question or critique its methods are often dismissed as complicit in racism, if not outright racist themselves. This binary perspective leaves little room for nuance or genuine engagement. It assumes that moral virtue is tied exclusively to one's public adherence to anti-racist rhetoric, rather than to the actual impact of their actions or the sincerity of their beliefs. This dynamic can alienate people who might otherwise support anti-racism, but feel unfairly judged or excluded from the conversation. When individuals are labeled as morally deficient simply for raising questions, expressing doubts, or failing to adopt the language and framework of anti-racism, they are less likely to engage in meaningful reflection or change. Instead, they may become defensive, resentful, or dismissive of the entire movement, rather than fostering understanding and empathy. The imposition of moral superiority creates a climate of hostility and polarization, where dialogue becomes a battle for the moral high ground rather than an opportunity for mutual growth. Moreover, the tendency to assert moral superiority often leads to performative activism. In this context, individuals and organizations adopt the outward trappings of anti-racism, such as posting statements on social media, adopting inclusive language, or implementing symbolic policies not out of a genuine commitment to change, but as a way to signal their virtue and avoid criticism. This performative approach does little to address systemic issues, and can even obscure the need for substantive action. By prioritizing appearances over outcomes, it allows individuals and institutions to claim the moral mantle of anti-racism without actually contributing to meaningful progress. The misuse of moral superiority also risks silencing critical voices within the movement itself. Anti-racism, like any social movement, must remain open to introspection and critique if it is to evolve and address complex issues effectively. However, when moral superiority dominates the conversation, dissenting perspectives are often dismissed or marginalized, even when they come from individuals who are deeply committed to the cause. This creates an echo chamber where only certain ideas are deemed acceptable, limiting the movement's capacity for innovation and adaptation. It also discourages individuals from speaking honestly about their concerns or experiences for fear of being ostracized or accused of betrayal. Another consequence of moral superiority is its potential to perpetuate cycles of guilt and shame. While it is important to confront uncomfortable truths about privilege, bias, and systemic injustice, framing these issues in a way that assigns blame or moral failure to entire groups of people can be deeply counterproductive. Guilt and shame are rarely effective motivators for long-term change. More often, they lead to avoidance, denial, or superficial gestures of atonement that fail to address the underlying problems. A truly effective anti-racism movement would focus on inspiring people to act out of hope, compassion, and a shared vision for a better future, rather than coercing them through moral judgment. Finally, the assertion of moral superiority within anti-racism can create a sense of exclusivity that undermines its goal of building a broad coalition for change. When the movement becomes defined by rigid ideological purity, it risks alienating those who might approach the issue from different perspectives or who are still in the process of learning and unlearning deeply ingrained beliefs. Rather than welcoming people into the fold, it erects barriers that make it harder for individuals to engage meaningfully with the cause. This exclusivity is not only counterproductive but also antithetical to the movement's stated goals of inclusion and equality. By positioning itself as morally superior, anti-racism risks alienating allies, fostering resentment, and limiting its ability to create real, lasting change. Its focus should remain on addressing systemic inequalities and promoting understanding rather than engaging in judgment or condemnation. Only through humility, openness, and a commitment to genuine dialogue can anti-racism fulfill its promise of building a fairer and more inclusive society. One of the most troubling consequences of some approaches to anti-racism is the inadvertent entrenchment of division through excessive focus on racial identity. While understanding the significance of race in shaping historical and societal experiences is crucial, there is a danger in overemphasizing it to the point where it becomes the defining characteristic of a person's identity. This hyper-focus on race risks fragmenting society into rigidly defined groups, emphasizing differences over commonalities and leading to a worldview in which people are perpetually categorized by their skin color, rather than their individuality or shared humanity. When race becomes the central lens through which all human interaction is interpreted, it can create an environment where individuals feel trapped by their racial identity. For example, white individuals might be cast solely as the inheritors of privilege and power, regardless of their personal struggles, socioeconomic background, or individual values. Similarly, people of color may feel boxed into roles of victimhood or seen only through the lens of their oppression, overlooking their diverse talents, aspirations, and achievements. This narrow framing not only oversimplifies complex human experiences, but also limits the way people are seen and valued in society. It reduces individuals to representatives of their racial group, erasing the unique traits that define their humanity. This overemphasis on race can also lead to a divisive and tribalistic mindset, where individuals are encouraged to see others primarily as members of racial groups rather than as fellow human beings. Such thinking can foster an us versus them mentality, where solidarity and collaboration across racial lines become increasingly difficult. People may feel compelled to align themselves with their racial group and view those outside it with suspicion or hostility. This dynamic deepens social divides and reinforces the very barriers that anti-racism aims to dismantle. Instead of fostering unity, it perpetuates a fragmented and polarized society. Moreover, the overfocus on racial identity risks alienating those who might otherwise support anti-racist efforts. Many people recognize the need to address systemic racism and promote equality, but when anti-racism is presented in a way that centers race above all else, it can feel exclusionary or even counterproductive. For instance, individuals who see themselves primarily through other facets of their identity, such as their role as parents, workers, or members of a faith community, may feel that the movement does not resonate with their broader sense of self. By emphasizing race to the exclusion of other aspects of identity, anti-racism can inadvertently limit its reach and fail to engage the full spectrum of society. This excessive focus on race can also obscure the systemic and structural roots of inequality, reducing complex issues to interpersonal dynamics or group conflicts. While individual interactions and biases are important, they are only part of the broader picture. Systemic problems such as economic disparities, unequal access to education, and discriminatory policies require comprehensive solutions that go beyond racial identity. When anti-racism becomes too focused on race as the sole factor in these issues, it risks oversimplifying the problem and proposing solutions that fail to address the underlying systemic causes. By doing so, it may inadvertently reinforce the status quo rather than challenging and changing it. Another significant issue with overemphasizing race is the way it can create a culture of hypervigilance and self-censorship in social interactions. People may become so preoccupied with avoiding perceived racial missteps that they hesitate to engage with others openly and authentically. This fear of saying the wrong thing or being misunderstood can stifle meaningful conversations and connections across racial lines. Instead of fostering understanding and dialogue, it creates an atmosphere of anxiety and division. Relationships that might have been built on trust and mutual respect become strained or non-existent, further entrenching societal divides. Ultimately, by making race the central focus of every interaction and issue, anti-racism risks losing sight of its broader goal: building a society where people are treated equitably and judged based on their character and actions rather than their skin color. To achieve this vision, it is essential to strike a balance between acknowledging the significance of race and recognizing the shared humanity that unites us all. Overemphasizing race may be well-intentioned, but it can lead to unintended consequences that hinder progress, deepen divisions, and detract from the fight against true systemic inequality. In addressing the complexities of anti-racism, it becomes clear that noble intentions can sometimes give rise to unintended consequences. When anti-racism adopts strategies that alienate, oversimplify, or divide, it risks perpetuating the very dynamics it seeks to dismantle. Fighting racism requires courage, empathy, and a deep commitment to justice, but it also demands balance, humility, and an unwavering focus on shared humanity. The goal must be to challenge systems of oppression without creating new hierarchies of guilt or virtue, to promote equity without erasing individuality, and to build unity without fostering resentment or division. If we allow anti-racism to devolve into a framework that prioritizes moral superiority, tribalism, or an overemphasis on identity, we risk undermining its foundational mission. True progress lies not in perpetuating an us versus them narrative, but in fostering an inclusive and collaborative dialogue where people of all backgrounds are empowered to work together toward a fairer and more equitable society. To achieve this, anti-racism must resist the temptation to replicate the very behaviors it condemns, staying vigilant against extremes that distort its purpose. At its heart, the fight against racism is about more than policy or ideology. It is about the dignity of the individual, the strength of the collective, and the potential for a society rooted in understanding, respect, and equality. By embracing these principles with clarity and compassion, we can ensure that the pursuit of anti-racism becomes a force for lasting unity, rather than a mirror of the divisions it aims to heal.